There is a specter haunting Europe. So begins Karl Marx's famous manifesto, one of the great failed ideologies that swept through Europe and the West. And yet it's clear to me that Marxism has been repackaged by its zealous adherents and sold to so many of my peers, millennials and Gen Z people, as though it's a normal, healthy, vibrant ideology, when in fact it's like a dead religion, being clung to in its dying gasps by its zealous adherents. And it's been repackaged and sold to people who have, I think, the best of intentions. People who, I think, care about those who are bullied. People like me who grew up watching Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and so many other things, and have sympathy for those who don't feel like they belong or fit in, and who have been bullied. And I think that Marxist ideologues prey upon those good inclinations and tendencies and sort of distort them towards their own ideological bends. We'll get right to the point. First, what is Marxism? Also, how has it been repackaged, and how has it been sold, and why it's failed? Marxism, of course, is often thought of as an economic system of government or the state controlling the means of production. This is, of course, Marx in his context, who is spent much of his time in London and the London Museum, lived through a time of great social change and upheaval. So just think back through your high school, college history classes. Christianity had spread throughout really the world, northern Africa, into Asia, certainly through Europe and the parts of the world that Rome had conquered. And when Rome fell, what's been called the Dark Ages, which are really a myth, or also called the Middle Ages, were times in which Christianity, Christians, frankly, saved civilization. For all the times that Christians had, destroyed pagan knowledge, so many Christians preserved the knowledge of the classical Greeks, or even of pagan stories like Beowulf. Monks were doing work in metallurgy and trying to promote science. Christian kings rose up in England and promoted literacy and unity and protection against pagan invaders. And these are the beginnings of the Western society that we see now, I think, the remnants of. This is a society, or really societies, forming a larger civilization based on what was called Christendom. Unfortunately, like all things touched by humans, civilization had, for all of its wonderful and beautiful things, beautiful architecture, increasing charity, the invention of hospitals. Success leads sometimes to corruption, and there were corrupt religious leaders. There were ignorant preachers. This led to great social upheaval. The Reformation was not just a small religious debate, or it wasn't just returning religious people to the Bible. This was a civilizational upheaval. Sacred art was destroyed. Traditional authority structures and institutions were overturned or co-opted. Wars broke out. Millions of people died. And the authority of Scripture and the church and tradition, these things in Western civilization were increasingly scrutinized. Now, Martin Luther and the Reformers would vomit at the modernity, the atheistic, and the secularization of Western civilization that resulted very quickly after their time. But it is what happened. And as the intellectual authorities were taken away from traditional power centers, deep skepticism at an existential level really seeped into the academic centers of Western civilization. And so, after the Reformation, you have the Enlightenment, and this is the self-deemed Enlightenment, people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and David Hume and many others, who saw themselves as turning on the light after the dark ages of religious superstition and all this nonsense. Now, to be fair, there is superstition in the world amongst religious people, was and is, but of course there's a lot of superstition amongst non-religious people. And it seems as though, I think, the naivete of men like Voltaire, that human reason can sort of just solve all of humanity's problems. If we just give people enough freedom and progress and democracy and science and business, we're going to solve humanity's problems. This has failed. Enter modernism. Now there's a lot of overlap between these movements. It's not quite as tidy as historians make it seem in your high school history book. Modernism and the Enlightenment have overlap, just as the Enlightenment and the Reformation have overlap. Modernism is another form of deep skepticism about tradition and the past. And so you have shifting views of power structures, whether it's from the Pope to the King of England, or the degradation of the workers' guilds with their workers' rights and protections and ways of doing business that gave opportunities to people, into the industrial age, which stripped away those rights and saw people en masse moving out of the countrysides and into the cities to live in factories, essentially, to be controlled by overlords, by capitalists who controlled the capital, the means of production, the factories, the machines, the buildings, and worked them sometimes under terrible conditions. So in an age of increased skepticism about the past, of tradition, of religion, contradictory, I think, views of both human rights and, I think, the increasing disrespect of humanity. People who are living in sometimes less than humane conditions. Now, the way I capture this in my mind is Oliver Twist.
Please, sir, I want some more. What?
The Charles Dickens novel, when these boys in London, in this industrializing age London, would be homeless on the streets, living in filth, and would be taken advantage of, essentially, by people who own factories. And the one thing, probably, I think, basically the only thing Marx got right, was that Western capitalism had problems. Now today, we sometimes in popular discussions think there's basically only two options: capitalism and socialism. Now, I'm going to give you my thoughts on this in a moment, but I think that this is a silly view of things. There's, of course, more options than Marxism or state socialism or capitalism unfettered. But Marx's view of society and of the economy, I think, is just blatantly false. Now, there are Ivy League professors available on YouTube for free that will break down on an economic level why Marx was just simply mistaken. But that's not my concern here. By the way, Marx tended to see society, or the economy, he tended to reduce society to the economy. And the economy is capital and labor. And it's a war between those who own the capital and those who provide the labor for wages. But I think this is already an overly simplistic view of economics. Clearly there is value to labor, and clearly there is value to capital, or those who take the risk and invest in whatever business enterprise. And also, it's naive to think that I think there's a problem with human nature that extends to both the laborers and those who own the corporation, the company, who sit on a board, who own the capital, who own the factory. Human nature can tend to be selfish and greedy. I've seen workers who are nearly worthless, who will sit on their phones all day, to be honest with you, and try to demand an ever higher wage while doing very little. And I've seen workers who work very hard and are taken advantage of by faceless, nameless corporations, people in a boardroom with unchecked power. I've also seen people, I think, bear the weight of the bad decisions of a government in D.C. that really isn't as concerned or understands their local situation. But what people often don't understand is that Marxism is more than an economic system. Though he saw everything through the lens of economics, Marxism is a way of viewing society. It's a way of viewing history. It's a way of viewing humanity itself. Remember I said Marx entered into the world as it was becoming increasingly skeptical about our own past, about God, about Scripture, about tradition. He was deeply influenced by a man named Feuerbach, who was a famous, very influential atheist. In fact, many of the arguments you'll see internet atheists making today as though it's an original thought to them is just a dumbed-down, recycled version of what Feuerbach made centuries ago. Many of his arguments, of course, have been debunked. Feuerbach and people who followed him like Freud and Marx saw God as something more like wish fulfillment. It's a projection of selves or longings or desires from our own consciousness onto the heavens, onto the cosmos. And God is, of course, a fiction. So what then is religion? Freud had his ridiculously stupid theory. Marx had his. Karl Marx saw everything in society essentially as a war between the oppressor class and the oppressed. So all social or familial societal relationships can be reduced to oppressor and oppressed. I think this is stupid. But he saw something what he called the superstructure. This is a superstructure that's created by an underpinning base. The superstructure would be something like religion or law or family or culture or art. But underneath that, sort of like if Nietzsche would say, you see a man who lives by his ideals, I see only a man in a mask. In other words, we mask our desire for power behind our niceties and politeness. But underneath that for Marx is really those who control the means of production, those who are actually in power. And they have power because they've taken it from those who no longer have it. This is, for Marxists, is almost always, if not always, an unfair power struggle dynamic. It's never a, I got this influence or wealth or power fairly. No. If I have more than someone else, I must have taken it by force in some way. And so those control the means of production. Art and religion and family and culture is sort of created by these people, typically as a means of maintaining their power. Now, if you've read Marxist theory or Marx himself beyond the Communist Manifesto, you're going to say you're oversimplifying this. I understand that. I'm trying to sort of encapsulate something for a point. And so those who tried Marxism in their societies, now Marx, of course, I think thought that the proletariat, the worker class, the industrialized worker class would rise up against the bourgeoisie, those in the base, those who have the power, the means of production, those who have more privilege or influence or wealth. They would rise up against them. I think he thought this would happen in some, industrialized Western city like London or somewhere like this, where he spent a lot of time. But ironically, it took place in somewhere where he thought it wouldn't happen, and that's in Russia with the Communist Revolution. Now, I hope I don't have to tell you how bad that revolution was. Now, here's the simplistic, naive thing I'm not saying, and the trap you should not fall into. Because I'm saying the Communist Revolution was evil and horrible, I'm not saying that civilization before that was a utopia or perfect or didn't need reform. But the Marxist doesn't want to reform, it wants to tear down and rebuild. It wants to seize power from those who have it unfairly, often by means of violence, and redistribute that power. And so I think Marx saw real injustices in the world, and I think had his solution for this illness itself was cancer. Stalin is a mass murderer, Mao is a mass murderer. To create this Marxist utopia, they didn't mind lying and murdering their friends or millions of others. And so Marxism is, I think, one of the great failed ideologies that seized power in the world in the 1900s, like Nazism and eugenics. Now, I would like to ask you to look into some things, do some research here. When Marxism failed, and many of the academics in the West, up into as recent as Christopher Hitchens, who went to Oxford and was a journalist, a famous atheist, who in his youth was a Trotskyist, saying if only Stalin had given power, if only Lenin had given power to Trotsky and not Stalin, things would have been different. If we can just do it the Trotsky way, things will work out better. We need to try it again, just not with the violence of Stalin. This is naive and stupid. It took a long time for Western academics to realize that Marxism failed, and it led, in every case it's been tried, to violence, a lot of violence. The brutality of it finally snapped people out of it. It sort of broke that system for many, it broke that Marxist hold on many of the academics in the West, and yet many remain. Many were in Hollywood, many still teach in universities. And I want you to do some research. President Barack Obama, and I think the Republican Party had a hard time pegging him down exactly what he thought, just labeling him everything, without realizing, I think, sort of the deeper and darker undertones of what's really happening in the U.S. and Europe. President Barack Obama started a production company to make documentaries. The first documentary that production house put out was on the American worker. And that documentary won awards. When the people who worked for President Barack Obama came to receive that award, you can get angry with me, you can get mad at me, you can call me whatever you want to. Look it up on YouTube. When they came out to receive their award, they quoted Karl Marx, saying the quiet part out loud, "Workers of the world unite," showing really where their intellectual affinities and loyalties lie. Look up the 5 olds in China. Look them up. China was once a vibrant, beautiful culture, and of course there was poverty, there was superstition, but the philosophy and beautiful culture of old China was stamped out by Marxist revolutionaries. Do yourself a favor. Look up the 5 olds and see how they did this, and see if that doesn't seem familiar to you. Do the things that happen in these Marxist revolutions ring a bell to you? And then look up something called the New Left. Now, not everyone in the New Left is a Marxist, but the New Left was people who realized that Marxism failed economically. It doesn't work. I've got my capital of Das Kapital here, or Capital, and you can get the Communist Manifesto, Marx's intro to, he had some thoughts on an introduction to Feuerbach, and other things that Marx wrote. You can read all these things, and you can see that economically it failed. And yet, the Marxist academics held on to, like religious zealots, this way of seeing society, the way of seeing humanity, the way of seeing history. Marx followed, as many academics did at his time, a man named Hegel. Now, Hegel, again, post-Enlightenment, is thinking of the world in terms of progress. And I want you to think, there's a lot of overlap here. The Enlightenment folks like Jefferson and Voltaire and David Hume and all these folks saw themselves as progressing humanity forward. And if we can just continue to progress towards human freedom, democracy, science, business, etc., we're really going to solve everything. And so, with modern science, you did have great success in many ways with the invention of the transistor. It was a world-changing thing. Not to mention the Gutenberg printing press, advances in metallurgy, on and on and on. And so, in a very short amount of time, you had people who grew up riding in a horse and buggy and then lived to see men walk on the moon, or the space shuttle, or the smartphone. People who grew up living in a world closer to the world of Shakespeare, and then living through the information and space ages. But yet, even in that, science has become something like people have some sort of a blind trust in scientists and cling to this thing rather like a religion. And so you had men like Freud, who wanted a very simple mechanism for explaining complex things. You had men like Charles Darwin, who wanted a very simple mechanism like natural selection or sexual selection to explain very complex things like common descent or change in species over time. This has affected theology, it's affected so many things. And so a philosopher, a German philosopher, saw history in a dialectic, a great sweep of history, as though history is moving forward. Now, with a caveat that I think you can move forward in your life, or that a business can move forward towards a goal, this general assumption of progress is, I think, a false, failed, childish narrative. As though history is marching towards some great inevitable goal, progress for the sake of progress, towards what? Who even knows anymore? And if you stand against my ideas, well, you're on the wrong side of history. Marx took that dialectic view of history and reduced it to materialism, almost to economics, to an atheistic view. And so religion, the thing that Christianity, which unified Western civilization, even throughout warring kings and queens, this thing that was so remains still so deeply ingrained in the psyche of Westerners, even atheists, whether you know it or not, that united this civilization. This thing was it's just a silly, for Freud, wish fulfillment, or some guilt, suppressed guilt over killing a tribal father eons ago, and now we want to make Sky Daddy happy. Or for Marx, sort of the opium of the masses, this thing where, just as people would go to these opium houses to escape the hardships of daily life with opium, with drugs, religion is the escape of the masses from the hardships of life brought about by the capitalists. And eventually, the job of the Marxists is to bring this to a violent revolution. And so, the Marxists, the academics, and I think these ideas have spread now outside of the universities and really into television and music, our celebrity classes, people who teach in high schools, many of my friends, who in many ways are nice, decent people who work hard, love their families, and would give you the shirt off their back, but have bought the ideas through the New Left and others like Jean-Paul Sartre, I've mentioned before, who see history in terms of this naive view of progress towards whatever goal, and use phrases like late-stage capitalism because capitalism is dying off to make room for what is the final goal of history, and that is this utopia. The utopia today may not be all economic. It may not be state-controlled, common-controlled, so-called, of the means of production of the factories. No, society and economics have changed since Marx's day. But the New Left, I think, had just shifted this instead culturally. The 1619 Project. I mentioned this before, but Howard Zinn he was a nut. He was an ideologue. He wasn't a real historian. Real historians have criticized his work, and his work was seen as fringe. In the movie Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon pushed that book as the book that geniuses read. Well, I read quite a bit of it, if not all of it. It's false. Sometimes people on the far left will point out dark parts of American history that people on the far right want to gloss over or ignore or pretend didn't happen. But just as the far right has this naive, overly simplistic view of history, including American history, or European history, or world history, so too does the far left, with Howard Zinn basically, I think, trying to undermine the underpinnings of Western civilization, making things up whole cloth or twisting things out of context, to make it seem as though there's an oppressor, typically the white European, Christian, straight, whatever, and the oppressed, and that's anybody else. Now, to be angry at real injustices in the world, wonderful. But to see the world through this simplistic lens and allow these people to use you to promote their agendas and goals, bad. And so what's happened today is, and I hate the term, wokeism. It's this, woke used to mean, the first time I heard the phrase woke, someone commented on something I posted, and it would just sort of stay woke. He just meant, now I use slang ironically, but I'm not a huge fan of slang, because I think it distorts the meaning of words. But he said stay woke, and what that phrase meant, what he meant by that was just be aware of what's really going on besides what the elites or the government tells you. Be aware of what's really going on, stay woke. But that's since been twisted and distorted further still into what you know it is. It's a view of society and history that sees everything in terms of oppressor and oppressed. It typically puts people under this hierarchy structure with people who are the most privileged, they think, at the top. And they don't do that in cases of individuals, but as classes. So the oppressor class is often white, straight, male, Christian. Male oppressor class, female, the oppressed. Now with all the obvious caveats that I've seen bad men mistreat women, and I want those women to have some means in society to defend themselves or to care for themselves or their children without depending upon bad or abusive men. I hope you understand this, or the real injustices in the world, or actual racism or oppression or slavery, or the slavery that's happening right now that Marxists are not as concerned with because they can't use it for their narrative. And then all those underneath it. And this has gotten increasingly zany and crazy to the point where the more accepted and privileged you are, in Derridian and Derrida's terms, the more in the center of society that you are, the more privileged you must be and the more you must be turned down. And so this is, I think, a cancer, a swirling mass, a toilet bowl swirling that's always going to pull things out of the center. Whatever makes it to the center, it's always going to pull it out to pull up the next crazier and crazier thing, to the point where monogamous or even polyamorous homosexual men, white homosexual men, are no longer oppressed enough. So you see people who are white, they call themselves gay men, like Sam Smith, no longer can call themselves gay men because that's too privileged. Well, you might have white folks who now have to feel like they have to identify with or claim to be some minority. I had a friend of mine, whiter than I am, by far, blue eyes, claim to be African American. You have political figures claiming to be Native American when they do DNA tests and are clearly super white. Because the mentality is white must be now the new bourgeoisie, and ethnic minorities or sexual minorities or people with different orientations or gender dysphoria or whatever, well, they're the new proletariat. They're the new oppressed. The idea, I've had people tell me that, well, we should let unlimited minorities from any other country in the world, even if they mean us harm, come in without any concern for our own safety because we're the bad people and we deserve what we get. Well, if you have Gay men who call themselves gay, who will walk naked in the streets in front of children and present their sexuality. Well, they've been sexually oppressed, so they have the right to come in and disband traditional heteronormativity or family values. Or you can have people who identify as trans go into places of worship. I've not seen it in Islamic places of worship yet, for whatever reason, but will pride themselves in going into cathedrals or churches and presenting their ideology, which goes beyond just sexual proclivities or the way they see themselves, but is now the way they see society and want to shape society. Because it's a power struggle. I saw CNN had a town hall in which they tried to reach out and be nice to various, people groups who are along the margins or were along the margins of the LGBTQ movement. Well, it was an absolute clown show because these people saw this as their opportunity to win in a power struggle. It didn't matter how nice the CNN hosts were to them. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that's everybody in the LGBTQ movement who identifies as gay or whatever, but this is a Marxist read of history where what used to be fringe Howard Zinn's movement has now become the mainstream. I see it in the New York Times and the 1619 Projects and thousands of comments on CNN or ABC's pages from news anchors, from public school teachers, to university professors, to celebrities, to my own friends, repeating talking points. Oftentimes nice, decent people who have absorbed this Marxist read of history, of society. This is cancer. This is moral insanity. Now, right now, it's still solvent. The cancer is still treatable, but that treatment has to happen now. So just a couple of things that have helped me through this. One, I want to sympathize, as Marx was right, I think, to recognize the injustices in the world in his day. We're often right, I think, to recognize real injustices, actual injustices, not the imagined ones, or the everyone's a victim nonsense. But real injustices against women or racial minorities, or insert thing here. I was shocked that the New York Times back in the day wrote an article blasting French Catholic immigrants because they were Catholic and they couldn't be actual Americans. They were coming in for labor, legally if I recall, but the New York Times was, didn't want them here simply because they were Catholic. Look, there are prejudices and unfairness, injustices in the world, and if you see those things and you're angry about them, or you see the unfair economic system, look, I'm with you on that. But Marxism is utterly failed. And this way of seeing sexuality and human nature and history and progress and the economy, supporting people like Bernie Sanders. I thought Bernie Sanders for a while was just, I thought he just wanted more, a bigger social safety net. Then I read something he wrote decades ago when he actually openly supported the state controlling of the means of production. This is straight Marxist rhetoric. Or to buy into the 1619 Project and these absolutely absurd views of history. I want to warn you against that. That's all failed. Don't be duped by these people. Keep your inclinations to want to protect the bullied. Whatever shows we watched growing up, Mr. Rogers for me, Sesame Street for me. To want to protect people who are bullied unfairly, to want to be kind and generous and charitable when we can. But don't allow those good inclinations to be co-opted by bad actors, or to allow your country or your society or your family or your community to be destroyed. So I'm going to commend to you something instead. I actually saw someone one time try to claim that you can be a Marxist and a Christian. And that means that this person didn't understand Christianity or Marxism. These are diametrically opposed systems. But to come back to this, it's not either Marxism or unfettered capitalism that would lead to something like Oliver Twist or children working in sweatshops. I'm more concerned actually about the injustices today, not of some imagined first world problem nonsense, but of the same people who complain about the injustices who will do nothing about corporate abuse of children working in sweatshops now to save a buck to make money off of you. Or the sex slavery that seems to be running rampant and using our own border, and the federal government has failed to do anything about it. And people don't complain about it because it doesn't win them some points in the cultural war against the conservatives or whatever. Those are real injustices happening now. and history will judge us by what we do about it. So Marxism is failed, but unfettered, industrialized capitalism. I have my issues with certain things that I think are unfair in our economy, whether it's government overreach, stupid regulations, but also corporate greed. I think one thing I despise, now I like fast food, you can look at me and tell I like fast food, but I think one thing I hated was being able to go a few years back to Taco Bell at 1 in the morning and see some little teenage girl, 19-year-old girl, 20-year-old woman working there for barely more than minimum wage to serve me a taco. Now you can say she's not a slave, she volunteered for that job. That is true. But is that what feminism has brought us? Is that what corporate consumerism has brought us? To just mix women's right to work and earn her own income? No, I don't like that. I think society should revisit, it should keep a market economy. Now, I think it's undeniable that capitalism, and I don't even use that term too often, market economies have done the most, undeniably, to raise the world, huge swaths of the world population out of poverty. Marxist system put a lot of its population further into poverty or death. But yet, even still, in these market systems, should there not be worker protections? Should there not be some fair agreement between the employer and the employee? I think there are, frankly, biblical principles here from the ancient medieval worlds. But I want you to do something for me. You can mock me, but look into it carefully. Look into, if you're tired of the extreme left, the extreme right, if you're tired of Marxism versus you also see the injustices in the world, look into Catholic social teaching. It turns out the Catholic Church, I'm a convert, it was a very difficult process for me. I had to give up a lot of my modernist prejudices and also my Protestant prejudices. And I didn't realize as an American Protestant, I also I had forms of modernism sitting in my brain. I didn't realize that for a while, but eventually it clicked for me. And my displeasure with both sides of the political spectrum, I thought, man, there's got to be a better way. And then, to my shock, I read Catholic social teaching. The Catholic Church has been there for 2,000 years. I'm convinced it is the church that Christ himself established. Whether you agree with me or not, the church is ancient. It pre-exists modernism. It pre-exists the modern West. It pre-exists fascism and Marxism. And so it has timeless principles from tradition, from Scripture, from Christ, that it has reasoned through, people wiser perhaps than me, at least more of them over more centuries. And in this tradition it stands and judges and understands modern ideologies, postmodern ideologies as they arise. And so the church was there to warn us. Though some Catholics probably supported fascism, the church itself began to understand fascism and ardently, emphatically reject it. The same is true of Marxism. It understands the dangers of a market system without worker protections, but also the stupidity, frankly, of Marxism and the incompatibility of Marxism with Christian teachings. So if you're serious about this, one, reject Marxism in all of its forms. That stuff is cancer. But two, there's a better solution, I think, that offers us better principles, which I think could help us not collapse our own society or violently revolt against our own society, but I think reform our society. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you know your life matters. Someone somewhere loves you very much. So take care of yourself. Remember, whatever you're going through now, dark days pass and life is worth living. So take care of yourself, and I'd like to encourage you to keep seeking God, seeking what is virtuous, what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. As always, thanks for watching. God bless.